My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College here at MTSU, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to our Honors Lecture Series on Native American culture. It's my pleasure today to welcome two of our guests, Gordon and Sarah Bell, who actually are the inspiration for this series. They very generously gave a donation to establish a scholarship for honor students who are doing research in Native American culture. So it was their inspiration really that gave me the idea for the series to begin with, and I'm very grateful to have both of them here. Actually, Sarah Bell will be one of our presenters in this series, so she will tell you about some of the very important and meaningful work that she's doing in South Dakota. I'd also like to recognize our Dean, Dr. John Weil, who's here today, and welcome all of you, both students who are in the class and visitors today. This is indeed an interdisciplinary lecture series, as evidenced by our selection of speaker for this day's presentation. Dr. Drew Sieg earned his undergraduate degree in biology at the University of Richmond and his PhD in marine chemical ecology at Georgia Tech, where he researched chemically mediated interactions among marine plants, animals, and microbes. During his graduate studies, Dr. Sieg authored several publications ranging in topics from competition among marine phytoplankton to chemical defenses used by salt marsh plants to prevent the development of fungal farms by invertebrates. That sounds very complicated, but actually it's a fascinating topic, and you should ask him about this kind of farming if you're interested. Dr. Sieg's research has taken him to coral reef and mangrove habitats in Panama and Belize, to salt marshes and estuaries in Florida and Georgia, and finally here to Murfreesboro, where he became our first ever distinguished visiting honors scholar. In addition to teaching honors courses in biology, Dr. Sieg has chaired many honors theses in the sciences, offered workshops for students on obtaining research grants and fellowships in the sciences, supervised independent research on parasites in bumblebees and honeybees, and recently started a project examining wounding patterns in urban and forested areas. Please join me today in welcoming Dr. Sieg, whose presentation is titled From Ethnobiology to Natural Products Chemistry Using Native American Folklore as a Source for New Medicine.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And for those of you that aren't familiar with 1980s films, I decided this would be a great splash image to show. This is a clip from The Medicine Man, in which Sean Connery goes to the wilds of the Amazon to try and find a cure for cancer. And even though this was made in the early 90s, he had this amazing technology where he could just take a leaf and stick it under a random machine, and it would tell him, yes, you found the cure for cancer. And so I really wish that that technology existed, and we're now close to 30 years since this movie's been made, and still that isn't a possibility. But it seemed fitting because he was playing an ethnobotanist. So, and I know that the theme of this lecture series is all on Native Americans, but I'm going to delve a little further to start the lecture in terms of topics. So it's nothing new to consider the fact that humans have turned to plants and animals as potential medications throughout history. And so if you go back further in time, probably the most clear example of this is using traditional Chinese herbal medications, or TCM, as a source for potential cures for any illnesses or other maladies that might exist. The first written recording of this is the Shenong Benkao Jing, which was written in around the 1st century AD. It was purportedly written by a mythical character, so you can take that however you will. But he surveyed 365 different plants and then grouped them into 3 categories and then combined these into 3 different books. One book focusing on stimulatory plants like ginseng, second book focusing on medicines, and then the third book focusing on toxins. And since then, there have been many, many additions to that initial 365 plants. And this continues to be a very popular source of alternative medicine. Right on campus here, we have a whole group of chemists and biologists that are focusing on traditional Chinese medicine as new drug discovery sources. You can go even further back if you want into the ancient Egyptians and look at the Ebers papyrus, which dates back to about 1500 BC. This papyrus is about 20 meters long in length, over 100 pages, and it's attributed to the ideas written out by Imhotep, who was a polymath that served one of the Egyptian pharaohs in the 3rd dynasty. And again, this papyrus focused on all sorts of potential uses for plants as medications, but then it also focused on charms and amulets and other magical spells as well. So you can go back pretty far in time and see examples of this. But the best source of botanical knowledge for about 1,500 years was the Materia Medica. And it was written by a Greek by the name of Pedanius Dioscorides. He actually was serving as a medic in the Roman army, and he compiled a compendium. I wrote it down exactly how many pages it is. It's pretty impressive. Where was it? So it's a compendium of all known botanical knowledge at that point. And it ended up being sort of the Wikipedia of the botanical realm. This was the de facto text to go to with the Romans, and then it spread into the Ottoman Empire, and then it spread into Western Europe. And it acted like Wikipedia in that as it spread from place to place, scholars added to it and built on it and built on it and built on it. So now there's a Materia Medica for the Ottomans, there's a Materia Medica for the Romans, and so on and so forth. And it was interesting because they were able, the original source material, the original writings no longer exist, but we can look at the evolution of this text throughout time, and with additions of illustrations showing the preparations of medications like you see here, and also really clear diagrams of plant structure as well as any known functions, good or bad, of these plants as medicinals or toxins. And so to sort of point this out, this is a later version of the text. This is Artemisia, which is also commonly known as wormwood. It's one of the main ingredients for absinthe, to give absinthe that original taste. And so Dioscorides was recording some of the known uses for plants such as Artemisia. And for this one in particular, he recorded it as a treatment for jaundice. What else did he have it for? Stomachache, vermifuge, which is internal parasites. And also he noted that it's used as an ingredient in absinthe. And so while we didn't have the ability to identify any particular compounds from this plant back in ancient Rome, it turns out that there were some really interesting secondary metabolites or chemical compounds produced by these plants. So one example is thujone, and another one is artemisinin. And so these compounds have known medicinal uses at this point. They come from 2 different species of Artemisia, but it's still the same genus. Artemisinin is actually in use as one of the most common alternatives for treating malaria parasites. And so both of these compounds act to sort of either, in some cases, they can stimulate the nervous system, but in other cases, they can actually go in and kill parasites within the bloodstream as well. So there were interesting compounds, but back in the day, nobody really knew what those compounds in particular were. And so stemming from this creation of a Materia Medica, over time, people started looking towards more theological explanations for why certain plants were good at treating certain things. And this led to a movement called the Doctrine of Signatures, some idea and a movement. But the idea was that if a plant looks like something, then that is God's way of telling you that it cures that thing. Which makes, in medieval society, this makes a lot of sense. And in some cases, it was spot on, and in other cases, not so much. So the classic example of this is Mandragora officinarum, also known as mandrake root. And so if you look at this, it looks kind of like a what? Couple things. This is the beauty of the Doctrine of Signatures, is people interpret them differently. Looks kind of like a person. You can see the arms and the legs and maybe a head. And so mandrake root was seen as a panacea. It could treat all illnesses. And it turns out that there are a ton of hallucinogenic alkaloids within the root of this plant that can cause all sorts of behavioral responses. It can act as a stomach, sort of cure stomach aches. It can also cause nerve endings to misfire incorrectly. And it can also cause a loss of the accommodation reflex such that your eyes can no longer focus. And there are dozens of these compounds within the plant tissue, all targeting slightly different parts of the human body because they're designed as plant defenses to begin with. sometimes, so you can see there can be potential medicinal uses for some of these compounds from mandrake. Other times it was more of a physical appearance and not so much what was actually going on in the plant. So this is a case of eyebright is the plant. You can see why it gets its name. It looks kind of like an eye, and so the idea was that it treats any eye illnesses. There's no real chemical or ecological or biomedical reasoning to actually support this theory now, but back in the day, you have an eye infection, maybe you should consume a tea made of eyebright. Sometimes using this strategy was even more dangerous. So this is Arum immaculatum, also known as the small dragon. And so if you use a little bit of imagination, what does that look like to you? Maybe like a snake getting ready to strike. So the idea here was that if you took a concoction of this plant and rubbed it over your body, then you were immune to any sort of snake bite. You could walk through a field of snakes and no snake would bother you. And so you can imagine that over time, this wasn't necessarily the best strategy to use because there are no antivenoms necessarily produced by this genus of plant. Furthermore, as a second example of this, the leaves, when ground up and made into a medication, were supposed to act as a way to cure wounds caused by spears. So you can see probably where they're getting that idea as well. And so it's easy to sort of poke fun at the idea of the doctrine of signatures, but if you look a little bit broader in context, you can start to see some interesting patterns emerge. And so there's a lot of cross-cultural use of certain genera of plants that might be a promising lead as a start for finding new medications. So this is a recent study that came out just a couple years ago, surveying the 35 to 40 species of pterocarpus, which is a pantropical tree that you can find in South and Central America, Africa, and the South Pacific. And this group did a meta-analysis and surveyed over 125 uses of various plant parts of this tree, and then looked for commonalities between different cultures in these three regions. And what they found is that while some cultures were using the plant for, it's a little blurry, but general nervous pain, poison treatments, things like that, you do notice that in some categories, all three of these regions were using the plant for a similar treatment. So we have circulatory and blood issues, gastrointestinal issues, urinary infections, cutaneous or skin infections. And the different colors represent the different regions, and you can see that they're using these plants for a similar purpose, which is pretty interesting. And then they used some fancy new evolutionary phylogenetics to start clustering plants to see whether or not certain species or subspecies of these plants are more often used than others, using some very complex math that is above my pay grade for understanding. But you see these clusters. So in this case, they're looking at which species of this particular genera were used for antimalarials. And you can see that even spanning across the neotropics and the South Pacific or Indo-Malaysia, we see certain clustering of plants that seem to have antimalarial properties. So there is something to this. There are certain compounds that can be used for these purposes, and that knowledge is spread throughout many cultures over many time periods, which is pretty cool. So moving into the theme of this talk, that was all pre-Native American stuff that we were talking about there. If we move into trying to use similar approaches and similar methodology for understanding Native American botanicals, it becomes kind of tricky pretty early for several reasons. The first is the cultural diversity. So there are over 550 recognized tribes just within the United States. This is a sort of crude map showing the rough locations of many of them. And these different tribes are living in very different biomes and ecological systems. So, you know, the flora and fauna found in the Southwest is going to be very different from what you see in the Northeast. And so if you consider the fact that there are over 16,000 native vascular plants within the United States, a survey was done and about 2,000 of those have been used in some way or another medicinally in over 18,000 different ways. And most of this information comes by word of mouth. And so trying to interpret what plants, what genre are good for what kinds of purposes becomes really tricky really quickly. And as I referred to just a second ago, there isn't really a good distinct written record for a lot of these traditions. A lot of this knowledge is passed by word of mouth from generation to generation. And so our earliest writings showing us the information that with regards to which plants do what come from the conquistadors coming into Central America and Mexico. And so one of the first strong sources for this material is commonly known as the Florentine Codex. It was written in the mid-1500s, and it was put together by a Franciscan friar as a way to create a codex to translate Latin and the native, I think it's Nahuatl language. So this Franciscan friar he had set up actually one of the very first colleges in the New World and was using it as a training ground to bring native peoples into the priesthood. And so he spent years doing research on the cultures, the traditions of these peoples, and then had it written in both the native script as well as using that as a codex to start translating into Latin. And so this, again, is a massive compendium. It's over 2,400 pages, over 2,000 illustrations, depicting everything from daily functions as well as uses for botanicals and other cultural minutiae. And so that's among our first sources for getting this information recorded. In the 1800s, we also saw a takeoff in interest of the botanicals used by the Native Americans. This started in New Hampshire with a guy named Samuel Thompson. And so he was sort of eschewing any use of modern medications. So any sort of mineral oils, any sort of highly toxic compounds that were traditionally used as medications, he was kind of suspicious of, and he would shy away from. And so he turned to the use of botanicals and published his work as an alternative source of medicine. He was also really against bloodletting. That was his other big thing. He hated bloodletting. And his idea, and I like this picture too, because you can see that he's holding some little plants there to sort of show off what he's good at. This led to a movement called the eclectic movement out of Ohio in the mid to late 1800s. So the eclectics were the hipsters of the medical realm, as I like to think of them. So again, they were very non-traditional. They would look at what the mainstream doctors were doing and then go the opposite direction, which is actually unfortunate because they were some of the first groups to start using antiseptics, so treating for bacterial infection. But then once the germ theory of disease really caught on and everybody else started doing that, they stopped doing it. So you can see the hipster correlation kind of coming through there. But some of the forefront members of the eclectic movement had studied and surveyed Native American cultures for uses of traditional medicines. And so they built that into their practice, and they ended up doing a lot of other really weird things with electromagnetic therapy and other things that didn't really take off. So their movement kind of died off in the early 1900s. But they wrote down a lot of the uses of these plants. So we do have some written record, but it's largely coming from Westerners coming and interviewing rather than the primary source. And so luckily, with the advent of the internet, it's becoming a little bit easier to start trying to find some of this information out. So if this is a topic that really interests you, I would encourage you to check out this website hosted by the University of Michigan at Dearborn. It is a database of known uses of plants by Native American tribes. And so you can put in either a plant by species, by common name, or by usage. So if you're interested in ceremonial chants, you can type ceremonial chants, and it'll show you all the plants that have been used and by whom for that topic. And then it links you to any references that involve that. So this is a really nice way to sort of act as a compendium for information, but you still need to start teasing it apart a little bit. So these are just two interesting examples that I pulled out just looking up the common daisy. So it's used as a ceremonial chant lotion, and also you can chew up a piece of it, spit on a sore, and then that'll cure the sore. And then we've got the references for that as well. And so the other challenge that arises with this topic is thinking about how medicine is viewed in Western society versus traditional indigenous medicine. So I pulled out some of the major comparisons that I could think of on this. The first is the focus of the disease. So in Western medicines, we focus on the pathology. So, what is the cause of the disease? How's the disease transmitted? How do we stop the disease? Oftentimes with Native American medicines, it's a community focus. So when somebody gets ill, they ask how they've been interacting the other members of the tribe? Have they noticed anything strange when they're out hunting? And look for a more community perspective here. Western medicine tends to be reductionist. We're looking for the causative agent of the disease, or the vector of the disease, depending on your question. Whereas it's more complex with Native American medicines. It's looking into, again, what were you doing in relation to what the rest of the community was doing, both the human community and the ecological community. Western medicine treats these treatments as adversarial. The bacterium or the virus is the enemy, and we need to kill it. Whereas with indigenous medicine, it's more teleological, which means what can we learn from this disease? So what lessons can arrive from this? The Western medicines are going to have a scientific focus. It's going to be slightly more intuitive with indigenous medicines. And then finally, the physician is the authority in Western medicine. He's the one that went to medical school. He knows how this disease is transmitted. He knows how to cure it. In indigenous medicine, the physician is more of a counselor. And so it's looking at, again, trying to find out what the patient can learn from this disease, and how can the physician or the medicine man support that knowledge transmission. So important comparisons to make. And when I was thinking about putting this lecture together, I sort of saw two ends of the extreme in terms of how you can take this traditional knowledge and use it to try and find new medicines. And so this is an arbitrary scale that I made up in my head, but it makes sense to me. And this is not a end-all kind of scale. But in general, you see with an increase in sociological merit, so going from I don't care what this plant was used for sociologically, I just want to test the plant for whatever secondary metabolites are in it, to the other end of the spectrum of we're going to survey these 100 plants that were all used by this particular tribe. So that's sort of what I mean on this orange scale. And then in general, the greater the focus on the sociological use, the less focus we are on the actual biochemical properties, natural products chemistry of the compounds within these plants. But then if you go to the other end of the extreme, where we have a lot of knowledge in terms of how this compound works, what this compound is, what class of compounds it belongs to, who are the biological targets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, this isn't a finite scale, but it gives you a little bit of range to start thinking about this. And so if we take these two bars and we start on one end, okay? So we're going to start on the low sociological merit, high scientific rigor side of things. I call these the grind and finds. And so I came from a lab before I was here that partially could be considered a grind and find lab. But the idea is that you collect as many plant samples as possible, and you are screening all of the chemistry within those plants against specific medicinal targets. So the lab that I was in previously were interested in antifungals, treatments for things like MRSA, as well as treatments for antimalarials and anti-cancer for certain cell lines. And so the cultural relevance is secondary, and if you find out that a particular plant has some cultural use, that's really cool, but that's not what's driving the research. And so, like I said, the research that I was involved in, it was a project at Georgia Tech. We were screening red algae from Fiji. We weren't necessarily paying attention to the cultural uses of these marine algae by the Fijians, but we wanted to collect as many species as possible and then screen them for medicinal value. And then a better example of this pertaining to our particular talk would be the CCNSC, which is the Cancer Chemotherapy National Service Center. And this was a project that was started in the 50s and 60s, and they were doing high throughput screenings looking for anti-cancer medications. And so they started out by just surveying the known medicinals, known natural products, and they were pumping through about 30,000 samples per year against specific cancer targets. And then over time, this project evolved a little bit due to the efforts of a guy named Jonathan Hartwell, and he was more focused on maybe looking at botanicals instead of everything. So it's a slight shift into the sociological. And then over time, this initiative was enveloped into the National Cancer Institute. And so one of the best, actually probably arguably the best success story coming out of this group is Taxol. Okay? So is anybody familiar with Taxol? Shoot of hands, side hands. So Taxol is one of the most commonly prescribed and effective treatments against ovarian and breast cancer. And it's a compound it's a naturally derived compound that comes from the Pacific yew. This is a plant you find in the Pacific Northwest. And if you scrape away the bark and extract the chemistry out of the bark, you're removing the bark there, there's a suite of different compounds, one of which is Taxol, which is this complex molecule right here. And so we have an MTSU connection to this, which makes it kind of fun. There was a botanist that retired from the department, I think right before I got here, Dr. Bloom. And as a graduate student, he was one of the guys that went out and was doing the sampling for all these different plants, one of which was the Pacific yew. So one of the first samples that got to the Cancer Institute came from what was then a graduate student that went on to teach here at MTSU. So fun sort of connection. At least that's the rumor that I've heard. There's a fun drinking story associated with it, which is probably not appropriate for this particular audience, but it is there. So this compound was found in 1965. And again, we're screening 30,000-ish compounds per year. And so the direct target of this wasn't known until 1977. A different researcher came in and started surveying small chemical compounds against ovarian cell lines. And then we found out that this particular compound was really, really, really effective at halting tumor growth in ovarian cancer. And so this has evolved into a $1 billion per year industry. A lot of money to be made from this particular compound. I think it's Bristol Myers Squibb that has the patent on it. And the issue that we are facing now is how do we generate enough of it? Because this is not a particularly common tree. And for a long time, it was hard to get sufficient quantities of this compound to make it medicinally valuable. And so there have been a lot of different strategies. The newest one that we're using now is we actually can take the pine needles or the needles from yews and other related species and grow them in a vat and then extract components from there. And even better than that is you can actually develop cell lines from the yew tissue and then grow it in co-culture with fungi. And there's some ecological, slightly curious, not quite identified interaction whereby the fungal growth in conjunction with being near yew cells leads to increased production of this compound. And so now we have these interesting sort of petri dish cultures of yew trees to grow up this particular medication. So it's pretty cool. And I had to sneak one sciencey slide in. I mean, there's a couple sciencey slides, but this is the scienciest of them. So if you get through this, you'll be okay. But in terms of how Taxol works, you have to understand a little bit about cell division. So cancer is ultimately uncontrolled cell division. Just cells keep dividing and dividing and dividing, building up into a tumor. And you get a malignant tumor if some of those cancerous cells spread into other parts of the body. And so different cancer drugs target different aspects of cell division to try and halt it. So you can either stop checkpoints to prevent cell division from beginning, or you can affect some of the machinery involved in cell division. And so the way Taxol works is it focuses on microtubules. So these are giant polymers of proteins that act as the molecular or the highways of the cell. So you have other proteins that can transport vesicles containing all sorts of compounds along these guys. And they also play a major role in making sure that DNA, once it condenses into a chromosome, splits evenly into two distinct cells, which is, I'm proud of this, I figured out how to put GIFs in. That's what you're seeing here. So the cytoskeleton, or the microtubules you're seeing in green here, they're highlighted. This is normal cell division. And you can see that these fibrous structures are pulling apart the chromosomes, which are in red. And once they're pulled apart, then cell division completes, and you have two daughter cells from one initial cell. So that's why this is important. And so what Taxol does is it binds to these microtubules as they're forming. And by binding, they stick like glue. And so the most important part of this separation is that these microtubules start to break down to help pull apart the chromosomes. And so by Taxol being there, they form and everything's stuck together like this, and then they're stuck. And they can't pull apart. And so if they can't pull apart, you don't get two daughter cells, which means that you end up getting one really confused cell that eventually kills itself through apoptosis. And so this is more a molecular diagram of what's going on. And so it's a really interesting compound, and it's a really interesting story, but as I said, there isn't much ethnobotanical knowledge. There's not much focus on the sociological value. So I did a quick dig in that Native American Ethnobotany database that I mentioned, and I found 27 different matches for Taxus brevifolia, which is our yew, and drug or medicine. And so the Kitasoo and the Clem and the Tsimshian are using the bark and the leaves for various internal ailments, The branches and the leaves are used for lung disease by the quinault and the bellacula. The bark and the leaves are used as a panacea, so treats everything. I love that word. And then one that I'm very suspicious of, where there's a reporting of the bark to treat cancer. And I don't really know if that's necessarily accurate, although it seems appropriate. And then if you do another survey, you can find that the same genus of Taxus is used by indigenous people in Asia as well for similar purposes. So again, that cross-cultural usage of particular plant phyla is apparent here as well. So that's the super sciencey, less sociological side of things. And so then we can kind of like venture over here and focus on this end of the spectrum, where big sociological merit, a little lower on the scientific rigor. And so I've generally clumped this in as alternative medicines. And so this is the idea of using traditional remedies as a natural treatment. There is tremendous anecdotal support saying this is a great treatment for, as a blood thinner or as a stomach aid or whatever. But the empirical testing leaves a lot to be desired from a scientific mindset. A lot of this revolves around anecdotal reporting. And when you try and do medicinal tests on this and actually do peer-reviewed studies, it's really hard to compile the data because everybody uses the plant kind of differently. So it's really hard to control for. But there are lots of texts on this topic. I have this one. I find it really interesting. The Handbook of Native American Herbs. It's a list of the most commonly used species. There's our mandrake down there. We mentioned him earlier. Pretty informative. Then we start getting into more of the New Age movement. So you got Sacred Plant Medicine, The Wisdom in Native American Herbalism, Secrets of Native American Herbal Remedies, and Honoring the Medicine, The Essential Guide to Native American Healing. And so I own one book like this, which I brought in, which is right here. It's the same book as right there. There he is. And I get a little nervous when the first thing that I see when I turn to in the page is the information found in this book should not be used as a substitute for the advice and care of a health professional, and the authors are not responsible for any adverse effects resulting from the use or application of the information contained in this book. And so what I'm going to try and do is tease apart what we know about the science and what we know about the sociological value. And so these are the concerns that pop into my head as a scientist. The first is, what is the medication? Because a lot of times they're coming in bottles like this. What is the scientific support for using these medications? How much should we be using? A lot of these are not under FDA regulation. And finally, what about the hoaxes and the swindlers? So who might be abusing this movement, right? And so if you go on the internet, you can find all kinds of interesting drugs. I like this one in particular, Discover the Healing Power of Nature. So old school, it's new school. I didn't write that, although I wish I had. Eco-medicinals, I don't know what that is, but it sounds cool. They trademarked it. And then if you notice here, we've got Kung Fu Fighter, Kick-Ass Immune, Kick-Ass Sinus, and Kick-Ass Biotic. Those aren't plants, but they're some kind of natural remedy, apparently. And so what I'm trying to get at is let's look at what's actually in these things. Okay? And it turns out that a lot of times plants, like I've said before, plants are producing really cool secondary metabolites. So I just picked up some out of a hat. You've got phenols like eugenol. This is 80% of clove oil. It can be an antiseptic and an anesthetic. It can also be used to treat a variety of ailments, but also if you take 5 to 10 mils of it, it can be hepatotoxic, meaning it'll poison your liver, which happened to a 5-year-old that drank 5 mils of it. You got your terpenoids, so things like menthol or mint, acts as an analgesic, pain relief, so it's the minty smell. Coumarins, so this is dicumarol. It's a fungal byproduct. It leads to the medicinal compound of warfarin, which you hear about on TV all the time. This is a blood thinner. And then tannins, which are a catch-all term. There's all kinds of tannins. They have lots of roles, including acting as antioxidants. They provide bitter taste to teas as well as wines, and they can, in small doses, improve cardiovascular health. They're also used, the name tannin comes from the use of these compounds to help with the tanning process to cure leather. That's where tannin comes from. So, like I said, pros and cons of using this. The main purpose of tannins is to make things not very tasty. Bitter is usually a sign of not being good to eat. And then coumarins, these compounds can also build up in, say, wet hay and lead to internal bleeding in cattle. So Low dose is good. High dose is maybe not so good. And this is not to overwhelm you, but you can do this with all kinds of common plants and find out all kinds of uses of them. And in some cases, we know what the compounds are. Sometimes it's just a clustering of essential oils or, I don't know, question mark. We don't know what the actual chemistry is. And then sources. And so to focus in on this a little bit more, I decided to pick one of the champions of alternative medicines, which is Echinacea. So it's purple coneflower. This is what purple coneflower looks like. For medicinal purposes, we're going to focus on 3 different species of Echinacea. And if you, again, you play that game where you look and see what kinds of treatments this plant has been used for. Snakebite cure by the Dakota, general soreness by the Cayenne, common cold. This one is pertinent because of where we're going. By the Cayenne, the Crow, and the Kiowa. It can act as a stimulant. It can relieve cramps. It can solve to reduce toothache. And then my favorite is as a local anesthetic. The reporting for this one is the idea is you take fresh purple coneflower and you rub it on your hand. And the medicine men would do this so that they could then dip their hand in scalding water for divinatory purposes. And so you got to make sure your hand is numb before you stick it in the hot water. So that was pretty cool. And so if you look at the chemistry in Echinacea, yes, there are all kinds of interesting secondary metabolites. And in combinations or individually, they can do everything from boosting immune system function. They can act as antivirals, antifungals, antibacterials, anti-inflammatories, anti-lots of things. And then also my favorite word of the day, mosquiticides. So they kill mosquitoes. But these are each of these is driven by different suites of these compounds, sometimes in isolation, sometimes in combination. And when you go and buy Echinacea, so you can get it in bottled form, you got there Nature's Wealth. Here's the Lakota version, which I find sort of strange. If you look on the internet, you can find out that it cures everything from colds to oh no, they didn't list cancer. Oh no, there it is, cancer, bee stings, tumors, which kind of falls back under there, hemorrhoids, gangrene, poisonous snake bites, all sorts of things. And so if you read this off the internet and think, well, hopefully I don't, but let's say you have syphilis, right? And you need to treat it, you might be inclined to eschew Western medicine and just take some Echinacea. Fair enough, okay? But here's where the crux of my story kind of comes in, is sometimes you have to be careful what it is you're actually eating. Because even though the fresh plant might produce all sorts of interesting compounds that have these properties, what you're getting in pill form doesn't necessarily translate to that. So this is a survey of 59 commercial Echinacea products, these guys, basically. And if you survey these, half of them don't have the species of Echinacea that they claim to. Sometimes they don't tell you what species of Echinacea they do have. So there's 3 different ones that can be used. They all produce different chemistry. Over half of them didn't meet the quality standards for their label. So these aren't under strict FDA approval, but they're supposed to tell you certain pieces of information. They didn't. 3 of the ones surveyed had something like 5 times the maximum allowable amount of microbes growing on their pill. Just be aware of that. We also don't know what part of the plant typically is being used in these pills. So the flower is going to produce a different suite of compounds than, say, the petals and the leaves or the roots. And generally speaking, these medications are these pills are generated by taking some plant matter, drying it, grinding it up, waiting a while, and then putting it into pill form. Some of the compounds that are effective in here might degrade after exposure to light in an hour or 2, right? So you don't know what specific chemistry is in there. And so that sort of gets to this point here. Here's how much Echinacea they're claiming to have in the bottle. And then we're looking at 100-fold declines in terms of what's actually in the bottle when you do chemical analysis on it. So 200 versus 2 milligrams. And 10% didn't even have the plant in them. So be aware, buyer beware, right? But it's really appealing to think of just using, well, Echinacea was used for hundreds of years. Clearly it has to be some kind of medication. And so this is where the placebo effect comes into play a little bit. So you survey, there's a study in the early 2000s, a survey of 142 cold patients, and they either gave them a pill with nothing in it, so a placebo pill, or they gave them a pill with Echinacea in it. And they didn't tell them which one they were getting. And then they saw how long it took for their cold to go away, and asked them to self-report all kinds of things associated with a cold, which is all that. And so what you'll see is that it doesn't matter if we're dealing with severity, aches, fever, cough, sneezing, runny nose, just like any commercial when you hear about flu season. In none of these metrics did the placebo pill ever differ from the Echinacea pill. They're exactly the same. It's some amazingly close alignment here. And the same group did a follow-up study with 719 people where they either offered them a placebo pill, a pill they said was Echinacea, but it wasn't actually, or actually Echinacea, or nothing. They saw a similar effect where if you take a pill, mentally you feel like you're taking some kind of medication and you, on average, get better about a day faster, even if it doesn't have anything but sugar in it. But the fun part about this study, and I couldn't find a good image for it, is if you take a subset of the people that are fervent believers in the healing efficacy of Echinacea, and then you tell them they're getting an Echinacea pill versus a regular pill, even if that's not true, if you give them the word Echinacea, they tend to recover faster because they think Echinacea is in the medicine. So, sort of interesting. And then I have to pick on the media a little bit as well while I'm at this. So this is an article from a couple years ago in the Daily Mail, again focusing on Echinacea. Largest ever clinical study into Echinacea finds herbal remedy can prevent against colds. Okay, great. And you read on, and this is a UK study, and it says that taking echinophores, which 4 times a day take droplets in your mouth for all of flu season, is how the treatment worked, will not only reduce the risk of colds, but also reduce the amount of paracetamol that patients are taking while ill, so generally not having to take as many painkillers. Okay, so that's cool, that's really useful. That's the first line or one of the first paragraphs in the article. Next article. The research, which was part funded by A. Vogel, the Swiss manufacturers of echinophores, was published in the peer-reviewed journal Evidence-Based Complementary and Alternative Medicine, which I don't like to pick on some journals over others, but that's not necessarily a high-impact journal right there. And then my favorite part, if you took the treatment, you got sick 150 times. If you took the medication, you got sick 150 times. If you took a placebo, you got sick 188 times. A difference that was described as borderline significant, which means it wasn't significant, and there was no difference between these two treatments. And the total number of days spent with flu was reduced from 850 to 672, a highly significant change. That's not the cold. Yes, they're both viral in nature, but the flu is caused by a completely different kind of virus than colds. There was no data that actually supported reductions in cold effectiveness over time. So all I'm asking here is, read between the lines a little bit to make sure that what's being reported is scientifically accurate, right? Think about the stakeholders. And so to sort of conclude this talk, because I'm an ecologist and this is how I think the best way to find sort of a nice split between these two fields is to consider the medical or ecological relevance of the plants you're looking at. Use a guided inquiry as opposed to a broad survey of every algae we can find or everything that the Lakota did. And so to point out why this is a good idea, I'm going to survey or ask for a couple calls. How long do you think it takes to go from pure compound to medicine on the shelf? How many years? 12 years. 20 years. Over 10. So you guys are in the right ballpark. Generally takes about 10 years. How much does it cost to get that thing to market? $1 million? 100 million? Around 800 million. What is the success rate? How many compounds do you have to do this for, or have to go through until you get there?
1%.
1 in 5,000. So you can see the struggles involved in this. And it's really hard to do, which is why you make a lot of money once you actually get one of these that hit. And so pharmaceutical companies are backing away from just the traditional herbal remedy as an initial jumping point, but it seems like a good place to start. But again, going back to the evolutionary ecology of this whole story, what you notice, again, this is a survey. In red, you've got plant species that are typically used as botanicals in 3 very different regions of Earth. And you find that there are similar patterns where similar plants are being used as medicinals over a broad geographic range. That's what that's telling you. So it seems like focusing on these plants in red would be a good place to start rather than surveying everything. And then also on the ecological side, we're a little short on time, so I won't do the whole call and response thing again. But what we're seeing is that certain kinds of plants are used more often as traditional medications by Native American groups than others. Trees are complex. They have bark, they have wood, they have branches, they have leaves, they can have flowers, they can have fancy roots. Grasses have a blade and some root. So generally speaking, the more complex, more pieced together, like more pieces, the more usage as a medication by traditional indigenous groups. And then if you start thinking about, well, what are they using them to treat, and then trying to apply those same plants to that kind of treatment in a clinical setting seems to work pretty well too. So this is a survey of medicinal plants used in Eastern Canada, and what you find is that the more often they were being used to treat infections, any kind of microbial infection, more usage by the Eastern Canadians, more species of fungi that were inhibited by those plants. So we get a positive correlation here, meaning that if it's used to treat microbial infection, it tends to kill microbes, which makes intuitive sense. So using this as a guided search, right? And then finally, think about the ecological roles of these compounds. Artemisia is not making artemisinin so that we can cure malaria. It's not going to get infected by malaria. But why is the plant producing it? So it turns out that if you screen compounds like artemisinin and look for the ecological role, you find that it generally is produced in young plants, and it's produced in glandular trichomes. So these are like little hairs filled with sap that are all over the plant. And then these can burst and then spread artemisinin, among other compounds, all over the place as an anti-herbivore defense to try and prevent the spread of pathogens and parasites, and also to kill off other plants while you're growing. So it's a process called allelopathy, which is near and dear to my heart. It's a wonderful topic. Less effective against bacteria and fungi. So if we're looking for uses of this, maybe stray away from these microbes because that's not what the plant is using them for. Focus maybe on here. If I remind you, so Plasmodium is, or the malarial parasite. So we see that artemisinin works against a parasite in the human system, also is used as an antiparasitic agent in plants. Nice correlation. And so I'll leave you with this. So 80% of our plants on Earth have not been screened for any kind of biomedical or ecological activity. So there's a lot of plants we can test through, not so many that, like, it's hard to decide which ones to start with. So you can either do the needle in the haystack approach, where we're going to survey all of the red algae in Fiji, or you can do a directed search, look at what plants are commonly used across cultures, and then direct your search from there. Secondly, we've got thousands of years of quasi-empirical testing going on. So again, looking at that cross-cultural phylogenetic support is a really good idea. It's a good starting point. And then my important point for everybody to leave is, if you have greater crosstalk between ecologists, sociologists, ethnobotanists, and chemists, we can streamline this process and have greater success rates. And then if you're considering alternative medications, I'm not saying that there aren't useful things to do with Echinacea, but there's a big difference between the pill you're getting from GNC and the plant itself. So just keep that in mind, and look at who's telling you that this is a panacea before you actually believe it. And so then I'll leave you with this as my other joke of the day. So this is supposed to be a chemist extracting these cool compounds, which is this lovely blue color, which never happens in nature. And of course, he has to stare at it the whole time. And so with that, I'll leave you. I've got about 5 or 10 minutes for questions.
All right, any questions?
So last week, we kind of implied that early pre-Columbus era Europe versus modern United States or whatever, Native American remedies were kind of delving into herbals, while almost Dark Ages Europe was sort of into witchcraft and alchemy.
Okay.
So first part is, would you agree with that comparison? And second,
Not entirely.
why do you think that would even happen if there's like foundational herbal medicinal history found in Asia, Egypt, and Greece? And why would that sort of reverse, in a sense, in Europe?
Well, I don't know. I mean, so again, I'm coming from a biological background, so I can't get into the semantics of the historical side, but botanicals were still being used through the Dark Ages. The problem was that the information, since the Materia Medica was written in Latin or Arabic, depending on where you were getting it from, not many people spoke those languages, and so some of it spread back into word of mouth. And then with regards to things like witchcraft, I can sort of point you to ecological, chemical reasons why that might be happening in the first place as well. So it still ties back into this idea of medicinals. So it's a good question, and I can't argue the historical side as much as I'd like, but it's a good one to bring up.
During that time in that period, weren't people, the plague was going on, weren't they using like that little nursery rhyme about the posies?
That actually has been debunked. But yeah. So the idea that pocket full of posies, like the whole idea is that every line in that song depicts a different stage of the plague, and eventually, ashes, ashes, we all fall down, we're dead, and then we have to be cremated because nobody can bury all these bodies. That's actually not necessarily, like, it's a fun story, but it seems to be sort of being pushed by the wayside at this point. Yeah. So.
Okay, so Taxol prevents microtubules from pulling apart chromosomes and stopping cell division.
Mm-hmm.
Why? So I'm guessing it's produced later on in the life cycle of a cell because otherwise it would be prohibiting cellular growth
Within the plant?
elsewhere in the plant. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it gets into an interesting question because there's a debate going on right now as to whether or not Taxol is being produced by you or by YEW, or the fungal ectoparasites growing on, or sort of on the bark surface. So the idea is that the U is actually producing a different compound, and then the fungus is converting it into Taxol. Now there's an argument on both sides of that. It hasn't been resolved yet, but it's interesting to note that in order to generate Taxol, you need to grow tissue with the fungus. But you're right in that if the plant was, okay, we're done with that. Where was I going with that? Yeah, you're right in that if the compound was free floating within the plant cell, then it would halt cellular development. But if you're thinking about storing this in, say, a vacuole where it's not going to be exposed to the cytoskeletal elements, then you wouldn't have to worry about that so much.
So if you need to incubate it with yeast to turn it on,
Mm-hmm.
could you not just write that gene into a plasmid and then produce it?
They've been trying.
Okay.
They've had marginal success with it, but it's hard to get the final product, and then it becomes really costly to go from the intermediary to the final product. But I see where you're going with it. Yeah. Yes.
Looking at the cross culture of the usage, the plant usage, and for medicinal purposes, what kind of functionality is there in a regulatory diet habit? I mean, are you finding uses in that fashion where it's anything
Like-
utilized as like a daily supplement?
Well, what you do tend to find is that a lot of times the plants that are most commonly encountered also have higher reporting value, right? So you do have a bias because, if you come across this highly toxic whatever, somebody takes a bite of it once and they die, people learn pretty quick not to use it anymore and they avoid it, right? So you do see some correlations between how generalized that plant product is to how often it gets reported in the literature. So that database that I showed you, there are far more reportings of these plants as food items or how to be used to build a house or a boat or whatever that have non-medicinal value. And there's great reporting in that as well. I'm just focusing on the medicinal side.
Is there any research in using native medicines for animals? Any animals, like veterinary?
There's a little bit. I couldn't speak. It's a good question. I can't speak too much to it. I do know that in some cases they will screen these herbal remedies in terms of the chemical constituents to see what kinds of effects they do have on animals. So, like I was saying, the coumarin that I showed you, it's a byproduct produced by fungus. The fungus grows well in wet hay. The wet hay starts to degrade, it builds up the compound, and then cattle eat it, and then they start bleeding internally. And so there are veterinary studies on that specifically, but whether or not they've done a broad survey is harder to say. Cool.